Sure. So our first recommendation is to recommend the removal of the distinction between hosted and unhosted rentals. This is in both Supervisor, both in Campos and the mayoral ordinances. So right now, unhosted rental can be rented for 90 days, and an unhosted rental has no limit. So this would make whatever cap is determined through this process apply to both. And the reason that the department is recommending this is that it's very difficult for us to determine if something is hosted or unhosted. So it's mainly an enforcement issue.
Okay. Mr. Starr, if you don't mind staying available in each one of those and
No,
that kind of
here.
review and instruction, that'd be great.
Right.
Commissioner Hillis.
So we're going to, I mean, I think it may be a little difficult because I think this also hinges on enforceability questions. So it may be difficult, not given resolution to some other later recommendations for me to make a recommendation on this. Yeah, but I'll ask some questions, first of all, on this. I mean, this is one where I think we made a recommendation last time that not hosted rentals be capped at a certain amount, and that wasn't taken by the Board of Supervisors, which I think was a mistake. But I'm troubled by just removing the distinction between hosted and unhosted. One, I think it's obvious when you look at a listing on Airbnb or elsewhere, if it's hosted or unhosted. I mean, you actually have to put in whether you're listing the entire apartment or the entire unit or not. And if, we do get additional information, it may make it easier to look at this issue. But I think what troubles me most is we see a lot of folks, and this distinction was made when we first looked at this, people who are coming forward and saying they're hosts and they benefit from Airbnb are generally hosted rentals, right? We don't see a lot of folks coming forward and saying, I've taken a unit off the market and I'm leasing it for obvious reasons. And I think the testimony on this was compelling, and it was compelling the first time we heard it too. So I think this is one of the areas where we're kind of punishing the good actors because of the bad actors. And I kind of disagree with a lot of all the legislation being proposed, and that there isn't this distinction anymore between hosted and non-hosted, and we're trying to come up with that number without that framework.
Right. If I could just respond a bit. First of all, we don't get that information from the hosting platforms whether or not something was hosted or unhosted. They can advertise it as hosted or unhosted, but oftentimes they will do more than one posting, and they'll also allow you to do both hosted and unhosted for one property. So we don't get that. We don't get feedback from any short-term rental hosting platform about what was actually done. Second, we have a provision in the code that allows someone to have an unlimited number of nights for hosted rentals. It's called a hotel, and you can have up to 5 rooms in RH districts if you get a conditional use. What the ordinance did last time was it basically created a loophole so that you no longer need a conditional use to operate a bed and breakfast in a residential district. The department would really like to close that loophole.
But you still could close that loophole by saying hosted rentals, because I think the 120, like in the mayor's ordinance, is too low for hosted rentals. I mean, given kind of some of the testimony we've heard, and I'm kind of, looking at the testimony, but maybe it's too high for non-hosted rentals. I think unhosted or should be lower. I mean, those are the people that we're trying to kind of get at. Those are the bad actors who are taking rental units off the market and leasing them, not the folks we've heard from.
Yeah, agreed. We could close that loophole by keeping the distinction and putting a cap for unhosted and a cap for unhosted. I think maybe Scott might want to talk about the enforceability of that. And
just anytime we're asked to make that distinction between hosted and unhosted, as Mr. Starr pointed out, and it's very challenging, and we do not get that information. So if you are going to ask us to make that distinction, our information needs go up in terms of being able to enforce that. Perhaps, I think it's a great discussion about what the appropriate number of nights would be. But I think, the separate question is the question between hosted and unhosted. I think we really need to have that be that there's no distinction. And if we want to have a separate discussion, which there's another recommendation about the number of nights, perhaps it is a higher number, and there could be a separate discussion.
I just think from a policy perspective, there should be a different number of nights. And I think we're kind of relying on a lot of this is not, a lot of our planning code is difficult to enforce, if not enforceable. I mean, we have provisions like the bona fide eating establishment, where it's based on a percentage of sales from, food versus liquor. Granted, you can go in and kind of audit and get that information. You could do the same thing for various hosts that are doing it also. You can go get some of that information. I mean, that's how taxes work, is you file taxes, you kind of base it on honesty, and you audit selectively. I don't want to kind of make bad public policy because it's hard to enforce. I get it, it's hard to enforce, but a lot of our planning code is hard to enforce. So that's, and I think if we want a number, you'd want to put a number on that kind of deters the unhosted, the non-hosted rentals. But I think we are punishing people who are doing hosted rentals. So it's.
Commissioner Richards.
I agree with the recommendation that we should do away with the distinction for short-term rentals, whether it's hosted or unhosted. I think one of the public commenters, I think during the housing inventory, got up and said, how do you know whether it's hosted or unhosted, short of putting a chip in somebody to know exactly where they're at? It's impossible. And if anybody on this commission can find out a way to do that, I'm going to invest in your company. It's absolutely impossible. I can't for the life of me understand how we could do that. What I was going to propose was, that all being said, I agree that the testimony from the people that have single-family homes with an extra bedroom or two had compelling testimony about the fact that it helps to defray costs. I was hoping, and I think we should add this to the bucket list, that maybe when you actually apply for the short-term rental, you could check a box that says, I want to be a bed and breakfast versus a short-term rental. That all being said, if you're a bed and breakfast, you have up to 365 days. You have an expedited process, and then, one-stop shopping gets it, and we have an expedited CU process. I would definitely support something like that. But on the short-term rentals, I think it's impossible. Bed and breakfast, it has to be hosted. You're a bed and breakfast.
Okay. Commissioner Wu, on recommendation number 1.
Thank you. Well, Commissioner Hillis didn't stick to recommendation number 1. Okay, so I am supportive of this idea of doing away with the distinction. I think that the crux of not being able to enforce right now is on this matter. There's been a leniency toward having the hosted stay be more lenient, more number of days. By default, that's going to be the number of days that's going to be the cap, right? Everyone's going to say they're hosting, whether or not they're actually hosting, and I really don't think there's any way we can tell if someone is there. I think that for people that want to rent out longer, the bed and breakfast is clearly an option. I assume it's still an option to enter into a lease with someone for 3 or 4 months. Is that true? Right? You still have those options. You can rent to someone for the summer. You can do all those other things. To Commissioner Hillis's point that there are parts of the planning code that are difficult to enforce, that is true, but I would be very hesitant to add another.
I'll add my 2 cents. I'm supportive of the removal of the distinction, and if there was a definitive way we could define if it was a hosted or unhosted, I would say I like your idea of having 2 separate numbers, but at this point I don't think we can firmly tell who's who. Commissioner Antonini.
I still stand by what I had said during my remarks. I think that, as a good analogy from Rich Ellis on the IRS, you fill out your form, you report your income. Sometimes you have to send a W-2, but most of your rental income, all that's it's what you tell them it is, and they make selective audits, and if you've told them to lie, then you're in trouble. And, I like the idea of an affidavit and 3 neighbors affirming the fact that this is a full-time resident. That would be a way to allow these people to continue to make the necessary supplemental income they need to keep their home or keep their unit. And absent, if I can't get that passed and as a separate thing, I would hope that those who've already registered would get some kind of leg up on the process. And then the bed and breakfast idea is not a bad one, but I would hope they'd have to go through a CU, and it would be a certain amount of expense, if I'm not mistaken, to get CU approval. And I guess they could still use Airbnb if they are approved as a B&B. And do they have to provide the breakfast? Because a lot of these guys are not providing breakfast. That's the other problem.
If I may, we cannot get any information from the tax collector's office about who pays taxes and how much taxes they pay.
Okay.
That has been a very clear line that the tax assessor has.
Well, I'm not really talking about taxes. I'm using the analogy of the IRS as the same kind of system you would have here. I thought you had these people sign an affidavit that they are full-time residents residing in their homes the majority of the time. And maybe we're not doing that.
No, we do.
Yeah.
We just can't verify that with tax information.
No, I don't think you're going to be able to do it with tax information. What you're going to have to do is figure out another way to find out if somebody is not actually residing in the house, and there'd be a steep penalty and maybe even a criminal charge if they've lied on an affidavit that they aren't residents that are there all year round. So, I mean, that's a suggestion. If we can't figure out a way to do it, then I guess my next best would be use the B&B option, and they'd all have to go through a CU process to be able to do that, which adds some significant expense to the, but once they're there, then they would be allowed to sublet as much as they want to. So those are the two things. Either way I could support it, but I think that I've heard testimony from many people today who rely on this whole thing, and it's worked really well. And I think you're going to have a lot better time, because these aren't the people you're really trying to police here. You want to make sure they're telling you the truth, but I think in most instances they probably are. There must be a way to verify that they're there. I think Supervisor Kim brought up the instance of somebody was not a resident of San Francisco and was trying to get their kid into San Francisco public schools. It's usually the other way around. I've never heard anybody, usually they're trying to get them into the suburban schools or something. So anyway, but I think there might be some way to do it. I just can't figure it out right now.
Commissioner Johnson.
I'm supportive. I'll have more thoughts on recommendation 8, which is the number of days.
Okay. Commissioner Moore.
I'm supportive of the distinction, of removing the distinction between hosted and unhosted, because I believe that there is a rightful place for this type of rental, but I also have to believe that the support of making it work requires the department to properly enforce it.
Commissioner Richards.
I think, to Commissioner Antonini's point about the IRS as an example, the IRS requires rigorous reporting for every transaction, and if you're not reporting it, you're actually out of compliance, and you could be criminally charged. So, that absent that here, we don't have that, and I even think with rigorous reporting, it's still hard to be able to find out where somebody's actually physically at.
Commissioner Moore.
In all of the many meetings we have, never ever anybody outlined of how you really report and based on what, since it is a private transaction and not a fully monitored business transaction with business forms, etc. We don't even know how the money is being exchanged. Is it a cash basis? Is it a credit card basis, or what is it? So for that reason, I think for the time being, this is the correct way of doing it.
For the time being. Commissioner Antonini.
Yeah, maybe the platform would agree, or the platforms would agree to include on the forms that they send in, along with their payments and stuff, which type of rental this is. Is it hosted or not hosted? I don't know. I can't speak for them, but it might be one way to get that information.
Should we call a roll on recommendation number 1?
Yeah.
So on recommendation number 1, commissioners, maybe.
So if we're voting on recommendation by recommendation, are these binding votes like normally when we vote?
Well, here's what I'm recommending, is that we sort of take a consensus vote here on each of these recommendations, and then at the end we'll have an opportunity to add things, amend things, or whatnot, and then we'll have a sort of a comprehensive motion on adopting a resolution for a recommendation.
I have a process question. So that could put, if I don't agree with one thing in the 15 we might come up with, I'd have to vote no on the whole 15? I mean, like when we were in the Rules Commission, Rules Committee, we actually were voting on each item to move it forward.
Right.
City Attorney.
I don't know that I need to jump in here, but you could also vote on each item separately, and then that could be the end of it, and that would be combined into a motion.
That makes a lot of
So
sense.
that each recommendation would,
Tally.
You could vote on each one separately, and then that being the will of the commission, vote on the whole
So whatever
motion
passes.
together.
That would be incredibly.
Ms. Rogers?
okay.
Is that what you were thinking of doing? Sorry.
Yeah, that was the staff intent, that we would handle it topic by topic. Of course, when we get to the end of the topics that we laid out, you can lay in any additional topics that you think should also be considered, and then no further vote would be needed. We already have the topic by topic recommendation of the commission.
Reminder, you're making a recommendation to the board. They have the final say, so you can choose to do it either way.
Okay. Commissioner Hillis.
I just want to, make a comment. You may vote, you may not like this distinction if it's 120 days. You may like it if it's 60. I just think there may be things later on that may change how you vote on this. So I think it shouldn't be binding yet. We should come back and say, like,
And do a final vote.
I've changed my vote on this based on what's happened later on in the
Fair enough.
recommendations.
So what does that mean?
I think we should kind of overall vote on the entire recommendation.
I would suggest that we could try to get to a package. So let's take these votes, but then put together a package. But if we really cannot come to a package, we can revert back to the single recommendation vote if it really doesn't work out.
I have something I hope that is most simple. I actually think we should vote on each recommendation, and then if you feel like you need to change your vote because we get to something later, we can just go back to it. So just keep track, and then at the end we can say we're done and we want to add or subtract things.
So it sounds to me like we're going to run through these, and this will be sort of an unofficial vote. It's just a sense of consensus, and then we'll sort of recap and try to get one single motion, and if need be, go back to each specific line item if we need to.
Correct.
Okay? So let's try to start this very complicated process on recommendation number 1. And maybe initially all we need to do is a show of hands of which commissioners are in favor of recommendation number 1.
Can we go like that?
You can if you choose, but I'll only count one hand.
Commissioner Moore had a quick question on.
This is just an unofficial
If at all
vote. We're
possible,
gonna go
I would
back.
like to have some commentary shading for the Board of Supervisors to see the spread of the vote, because there is indeed a larger spectrum of opinions, and I think the public should have the benefit of seeing that we represent that broader kind of flavor.
I agree. I'd like to see a roll call on each.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Then on recommendation number 1, Commissioner Antonini.
No.
Commissioner Hillis.
No.
Commissioner Johnson.
Aye.
Commissioner Moore.
Right.
Commissioner Richards.
Aye.
Commissioner Wu.
Aye.
And Commission President Fong.
Aye.
So that recommendation theoretically would get added to the recommendation for the supervisors by a vote of 5-2, with Commissioners Antonini and Hillis voting against.